Welcome back. When we left the story, the Ice Age world was already disappearing. Climates had shifted, coastlines were moving, and many of the animals that had shaped human life for thousands of years were becoming rarer or vanishing altogether. But one of the most extraordinary losses had already begun much earlier. There was once a time when Homo sapiens was not the only kind of human on Earth. Neanderthals were here, Denisovans were here, and our ancestors met them. Some of those encounters left no stories behind, but they left something even harder to erase. They left traces inside us. Long before anyone raised the pillars at Göbekli Tepe, there had already been another kind of lost world, one so unfamiliar that even the word civilization does not quite fit it. For much of our species' existence, being human did not necessarily mean being the only kind of human. Today, every living person belongs to one surviving human species, Homo sapiens. The differences among us can be striking in appearance, language, culture, and ancestry, but biologically, we are members of the same species. That situation is relatively recent. When early modern humans moved through parts of Eurasia, they entered landscapes where other human populations had already been living for very long periods. Neanderthals occupied large areas of Europe and Western Asia. Farther east, Denisovans are known primarily through fragmentary physical remains and, remarkably, through ancient DNA. The exact geography and history of these populations continues to be refined as new evidence appears. But one fact is no longer seriously mysterious. They met us. And some of those encounters resulted in children. The evidence is carried by living people. Many people with ancestry outside sub-Saharan Africa possess a small proportion of Neanderthal-derived DNA, while Denisovan ancestry survives at particularly significant levels in some populations in Oceania and parts of Asia. The percentages and histories vary, but the larger meaning is extraordinary. Something happened tens of thousands of years ago that no oral story needed to survive for us to know it happened. Bodies remembered. Ancient DNA transformed our picture of human prehistory, partly because archaeology alone could not tell the whole story. A fragment of bone can look almost insignificant in a museum drawer. Genetic material recovered from ancient remains can reveal relationships, population movements, and interbreeding that nobody could have reconstructed from appearance alone. And suddenly, the deep past became crowded. It is worth resisting the urge to make those encounters cinematic. We do not know what the first meetings between particular groups looked like. We cannot responsibly invent a scene in which one band of modern humans walks into a valley and dramatically discovers Neanderthals staring back. The reality was probably much more varied. Some populations may have occupied neighboring territories for long periods. Some encounters may have been brief. There may have been competition. There may have been avoidance. There was certainly enough contact for genetic exchange to occur. Beyond that, details become difficult. But the practical questions are fascinating precisely because we cannot answer them easily. Could people recognize immediately that strangers were different? How different did they appear at ordinary conversational distance? Could they communicate? Did gestures bridge linguistic differences? Did one group learn technologies from another? Were some encounters violent? Were others cooperative? How did mixed families fit into existing social networks? We have genetic evidence for biological contact, but almost no access to its social meaning. This is an unusual kind of historical silence. With later civilizations, we often know what rulers claimed while knowing very little about ordinary people. Here, we know that intimate encounters occurred while having no names, no sentences, and no remembered explanation for any of them. Even the labels we use, Neanderthal, Denisovan, are ours. The people themselves did not know they belonged to archaeological categories. They had their own social identities, their own distinctions between familiar people and strangers, their own ways of recognizing kin, their own knowledge of territory. Whatever they called themselves disappeared with them. Neanderthals were not the crude half-human caricatures that older popular culture often produced. Archaeological evidence shows populations capable of sophisticated stone technology, controlled use of fire, successful exploitation of difficult environments, and behaviors that require us to treat them as complex humans rather than failed preliminary versions of ourselves. That last point matters. Evolution does not work like a staircase, with modern humans standing proudly on the top step. Different human populations existed alongside one another, diverged, met again, exchanged genes, and eventually followed different demographic paths. The surviving branch naturally gets to write the diagram. This can make extinction look inevitable when it was nothing of the kind. A Neanderthal child, born tens of thousands of years ago, did not belong to a dying species in any meaningful personal sense. The child belonged to the world that existed. There was food to obtain, cold to manage, tools to learn, other people to understand, injuries to survive, places that older members of the group knew better. The future disappearance of Neanderthals was no more visible from inside that childhood than the distant future of our own species is visible from inside ours. And then, over time, Neanderthals ceased to exist as a distinct population. The reasons remain the subject of extensive study and debate, involving demographic vulnerability, environmental change, interaction with expanding Homo sapiens populations, competition, assimilation through interbreeding, and probably different combinations of pressures in different places. The disappearance should not be compressed into a simple story in which modern humans arrived and immediately eliminated everyone else. Population history rarely behaves that cleanly. Small populations are vulnerable in ways that large populations are not. A few poor reproductive years matter more. Local disasters matter more. Loss of social connections matters more. If groups are thinly distributed across large territories, the disappearance of a neighboring community can remove potential mates, exchange partners, and information. Extinction can therefore emerge from accumulation. Fewer groups, greater distance between them, less resilience after bad years, more competition in some regions, absorption into another population in others. Eventually, the distinct population is gone, even though fragments of its ancestry remain inside descendants of the people who encountered it. This is a very different form of survival from the one found in flood myths. No boat preserves the old world. No chosen family carries everything forward. Instead, one population disappears into another so thoroughly that tens of thousands of years later, we need genetics to discover that the meeting happened. There is something almost unsettling in that. A lost human population can survive without surviving as a people. Their genes continue. Their identity does not. The same broad lesson applies to Denisovans, although our physical evidence for them is much more limited. Their discovery itself is a reminder of how incomplete the human story remains. A small amount of ancient material, combined with genetic analysis, revealed a population whose existence had not been recognized in the traditional picture of prehistory. That does not mean an unlimited number of unknown human civilizations are waiting to be discovered, but it does mean our family history has already contained major surprises. The past is not obliged to match the categories we built before finding the evidence. And there is another reason this vanished multi-human world matters to our larger question. Stories about earlier beings, giants, ancestors, culture heroes, races, before the present people appear in many mythologies. It is tempting to connect those stories directly to Neanderthals or other archaic humans. The temptation should be resisted. There is no good evidence that a particular myth about an earlier race preserves a cultural memory of Neanderthals across tens of thousands of years. Similarity is not continuity. Humans can invent previous peoples without having inherited a memory of another human species. But, once again, reality is strange enough without the unsupported connection. There truly were other human populations. Our ancestors truly encountered some of them. They truly disappeared as distinct populations. If a novelist had invented that premise before ancient DNA confirmed it, it might have sounded like speculative fiction. The archaeology of deep time repeatedly produces this experience. What is proven can sometimes be stranger than what was imagined. The ecological world surrounding these humans was different as well. Across different regions and periods of the Pleistocene, people shared landscapes with large animals that later disappeared. The exact communities varied enormously by geography, so there was never one universal Ice Age scene containing every famous prehistoric creature together. But in parts of Eurasia and the Americas, human beings encountered animals of a scale and abundance that would transform how a modern person experienced the landscape. Mammoths are the obvious example. Their size makes them irresistible to modern imagination. But for people who lived alongside them, mammoths were not prehistoric. They were simply animals. Dangerous, useful, familiar, perhaps culturally meaningful, and in some places, important sources of material, as well as food. Their bones and tusks could become resources. Their movements mattered. Knowing where large animals traveled could shape human movement in return. Then, over long periods, and with different timing in different regions, many of those large-bodied species disappeared. The causes of late Pleistocene extinctions remain complex. Climate change, altered habitats, and vegetation. Humans added new hunting and ecological pressures in many regions. Different species responded differently, and there is no need to force all extinctions into a single global event. For the people living through them, however, the distinction between gradual decline and final extinction would have been difficult to see. Extinction has no obvious last chapter. The final mammoth in a region does not arrive carrying a sign. An animal becomes less common. Hunters travel farther. Old locations fail. A successful hunt becomes unusual enough to be remembered. Then people stop seeing the animal altogether. For a while, they may assume it still survives elsewhere, beyond the next valley, farther north, across the water, somewhere older hunters once traveled. This is where geography and memory interact. An animal can disappear locally long before people understand that it is disappearing everywhere. Stories continue after encounters stop. Children learn the shape of something they have never seen. A generation later, the distinction between remembered animal and extraordinary ancestral creature may become harder to maintain. We cannot trace most prehistoric stories through that transformation, because the stories themselves are gone. But we can see the physical sequence. Animals existed. Humans encountered them. Animals disappeared. Human culture continued. The ecological knowledge built around those animals became obsolete. That last part is easy to overlook. When a species disappears, people do not only lose meat or material, they lose accumulated knowledge, where the animal travels, when it reproduces, how it reacts when frightened, which terrain is useful for hunting it, how its body can be processed, what parts can be made into tools, any ritual or social meaning attached to it. A disappearing species, therefore, removes a small section of human culture with it. The same principle applies to landscapes and languages and technologies. A world is made of relationships, not simply objects. Remove enough relationships, and the world becomes something else, even if the people remain. This helps explain why the transition out of the Ice Age was so profound. It was not one catastrophe, it was a rearrangement. The climate changed, sea levels rose, ecological communities shifted. Many large animals disappeared. Human populations moved. Other human populations had already vanished or been absorbed. And across some regions, people began investing more heavily in particular places and particular food resources. The human world was becoming less Pleistocene and more recognizably Holocene. But that phrase can make the transition sound smoother than it was. There was no morning when people woke up in the Holocene and discovered that prehistory had entered a new phase. People inherited whatever conditions their parents had managed to survive. Then they modified their behavior slightly. That is how enormous historical transformations often happen, one practical decision at a time. Stay here longer this year. Collect more of this plant. Store some for later. Repair the structure instead of abandoning it. Return to the same place next season. Clear an area. Protect useful plants. Spend more labor processing seeds. Build something that will still be here next year. None of these decisions individually create civilization. Together, repeated across generations, they can change the relationship between humans and land. Mobility provides flexibility. Permanence provides investment. And investment creates ownership of a kind, even before formal property law exists. If you have spent weeks constructing something, you care who uses it. If your group has stored food, you care who has access to it. If generations repeatedly return to the same place, the place acquires history. Certain people may gain authority because they know the rituals, resources, relationships, or schedules that hold the community together. Social complexity does not wait politely for writing. It begins whenever enough people have enough shared problems. Permanent neighbors are one of them. A small, mobile group can sometimes resolve a serious disagreement by separating. Sedentary communities make that more difficult. The house remains. The storage remains. The useful land remains. The irritating neighbor also remains. Settled life solved the inconvenience of carrying much of your world with you, while introducing the enduring inconvenience of having other people permanently nearby. More seriously, concentration creates problems of waste, disease, access, food distribution, and conflict. It also creates possibilities. More people can exchange information. Specialized skills can develop. Large projects become possible. Ritual gatherings can draw communities together. Labor can be coordinated beyond a single household. This is where the conventional story of civilization used to feel comfortably linear. First, people hunted and gathered. Then they discovered agriculture. Then they settled. Then villages appeared. Then organized religion and monumental construction. Then cities. The sequence is attractive because each stage seems to prepare neatly for the next. Archaeology has made that picture increasingly difficult to maintain. The transition toward agriculture and settled life was neither uniform nor simultaneous. Different communities combined mobility, cultivation, hunting, gathering, storage, and settlement in different ways. And monumental communal activity does not wait until the end of the sequence. That is what makes the limestone hills of southeastern Anatolia so important. By the time people began constructing the monumental enclosures at Göbekli Tepe in the 10th millennium BCE, they were emerging from the climatic instability of the late Pleistocene into the early Holocene. They did not have cities in the later Mesopotamian sense. They did not leave us kings. They did not leave tax archives. They did not leave a written explanation of what their pillars meant. Yet they organized people to quarry, shape, move, decorate, and erect massive stones. This should make us cautious about the word primitive. Complexity does not always arrive wearing the clothes we expect. A community can possess no writing and still coordinate difficult work. It can have no palace and still create powerful shared spaces. It can lack metal tools and still understand stone intimately. It can have no bureaucratic archive and still maintain social obligations capable of bringing many people together. And if we judge human sophistication only by the technologies familiar to our own civilization, we will repeatedly misunderstand the past. Ancient high technology did exist. It simply did not mean electricity. A carefully manufactured stone point can represent generations of accumulated knowledge. A composite tool combines materials with different physical properties. Adhesives require understanding substances and preparation. Clothing allows human bodies to survive environments they were not naturally built to tolerate. Watercraft turn barriers into routes. Food preservation moves calories through time. Navigation moves knowledge through space. None of this is mysterious, but none of it is simple either. A person who knows how to cross a difficult landscape safely possesses information that may be more valuable in that world than almost anything we would call advanced today. Take that knowledge away, and a perfectly intelligent person can die very quickly. This is one reason the idea of a lost technology needs to be handled carefully. Knowledge disappears easily when only a small number of people possess it. A particular method of working material may vanish. A route may be forgotten. A medicinal practice can disappear when specialists die. A boat-building tradition can collapse if communities stop traveling by water. Technology is not only the artifact, it is the chain of people capable of reproducing it. Break the chain, and an ordinary object becomes impossible to make. This kind of technological loss happened repeatedly in human history, and almost certainly throughout prehistory. But it is very different from claiming that prehistoric people possessed industrial technologies for which no independent evidence remains. There is no need to make them modern in order to make them impressive. In fact, doing so can diminish what they actually achieved. The people who eventually worked at Göbekli Tepe faced a problem that sounds simple until you try to solve it without modern equipment. There is a large piece of stone. It is part of the bedrock. You want it somewhere else. First, it has to be selected, then separated, then shaped, then transported, then positioned, then raised. Every stage requires decisions. Stone is heavy in an exceptionally uncooperative way. It does not care that the design is sacred. It does not become lighter because many people are enthusiastic. Human labor has limits. Rope has limits. Wood has limits. Ground conditions matter. A slope can help or ruin the attempt, and everyone doing the work must still eat. The surviving pillar is therefore only the visible end of a much larger social system. Somebody organized labor. Somebody obtained food. Somebody possessed the technical knowledge. Somebody decided where the pillar belonged. Somebody understood the imagery carved into it. People returned. Projects continued. The architecture accumulated. We have the stones. Almost everything else that made the stones possible is missing. That is the kind of missing civilization we should be interested in. Not an invisible empire inserted behind the archaeology. The invisible human organization already required by the archaeology itself. It is harder to reconstruct because social relationships do not fossilize. Authority does not fossilize. Trust does not fossilize. An agreement between two groups leaves no layer in the ground. A dispute over labor disappears unless it ends in something archaeologically visible. The stones survive the people who argued about moving them, and the carvings survive the stories that explained them. This produces a strange imbalance. Göbekli Tepe can look more mysterious today than it may have looked to the people who built it. To them, the meaning of a particular animal image may have been obvious. The reason for gathering may have been ordinary knowledge. The identity of the people allowed into a space may have been socially understood. Nothing needed to be written, because everyone who mattered already knew. Then everyone who knew died. Generation followed generation. Use changed. The structures were eventually filled in, and the site passed out of active cultural memory. Thousands of years later, the stones remained without their explanation. This is how archaeology creates mystery. Not because ancient people necessarily intended to hide anything from us, because objects can survive meaning. And once meaning is gone, modern humans become very creative. Göbekli Tepe has therefore attracted claims involving lost civilizations, forgotten advanced knowledge, survivors of global catastrophe, and connections to cultures separated from it by enormous distances and periods of time. The temptation is understandable. The site is old. It is monumental. It appeared earlier than many people expected such architecture to appear. And it sits chronologically not terribly far, on the scale of deep history, from the end of the Younger Dryas. Put those facts beside one another, and a dramatic story almost writes itself. A catastrophe destroys an advanced civilization. Survivors travel to hunter-gatherers. They teach astronomy, architecture, and agriculture. Göbekli Tepe becomes their monument. There is only one problem. The archaeological evidence does not require those teachers. The people already living in the region were capable of innovation. They had thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. They were not empty vessels waiting for civilization to arrive from somewhere else. This is a recurring weakness in lost civilization stories. When ancient people achieve something impressive, the achievement is removed from them. Someone more advanced must have taught them. A vanished race. Atlanteans, visitors from elsewhere. The explanation appears to honor the monument while quietly underestimating its builders. Göbekli Tepe is more disruptive when we allow its builders to remain themselves. Hunter-gatherers and communities in the changing Neolithic world could organize at scales once underestimated. Ritual and communal gathering may have played important roles before the fully agricultural, urban societies familiar from later history. The sequence was not civilization arriving after simplicity. Complex human organization was already developing in forms that do not fit our later categories. That realization changes the central question again. If we ask whether a lost advanced civilization existed before Göbekli Tepe, we may spend so much time searching for imaginary teachers that we miss the extraordinary society represented by the site itself. The previous world was not hidden behind the stones. It was the world that raised them, a world without writing, without kings we can name, without cities in the later Mesopotamian form, without a surviving explanation of its beliefs, and yet capable of bringing people together around monumental architecture more than 11,000 years ago. That world did not become ours in a straight line. Over the millennia that followed, people across Southwest Asia experimented with increasingly settled life, cultivation, domestication, storage, and new forms of social organization. The old mobile world did not vanish everywhere at once. Hunter-gatherers continued living alongside agricultural communities in many times and places. But another major human transformation was underway. People were beginning to stay, and staying would eventually change almost everything. The relationship with food, with property, with disease, with strangers, with labor, with authority, with the dead, with the land itself. Once a community invests enough in one place, losing that place becomes much more expensive. And once enough food can be stored, someone must decide who controls the storage. The world that would eventually produce villages, temples, states, armies, taxes, and cities was beginning to take shape. But before we follow that transformation, we need to stop at the place where our neat story of civilization becomes particularly uncomfortable. On a limestone ridge, people without writing had already raised monuments. They left us no message explaining who they were, only the work. And more than 11,000 years later, we are still trying to decide what kind of world could have made it. Göbekli Tepe sits on a limestone ridge in southeastern Anatolia, overlooking a landscape that today seems dry, open, and ancient enough to encourage almost any story you might wish to tell about it. More than 11,000 years ago, people began creating monumental structures there. The dates matter. The earliest monumental activity belongs broadly to the 10th millennium BCE, after the end of the Younger Dryas and during the early pre-pottery Neolithic. This places Göbekli Tepe thousands of years before the pyramids of Egypt and long before the first cities of Mesopotamia. That comparison has made the site famous. It has also caused trouble. Saying that something existed before the pyramids tells us that it is very old. It does not tell us that it came from a civilization resembling Egypt, nor that an unknown civilization must have taught its builders. The people responsible for Göbekli Tepe belonged to a prehistoric world whose social organization we are still reconstructing. And the old image of them as simple wandering hunter-gatherers waiting for agriculture to make them sophisticated has not survived very well. They were already doing something complicated. Large T-shaped limestone pillars were quarried, shaped, decorated, transported, and erected within monumental enclosures. Some pillars carry striking carvings of wild animals: snakes, foxes, boars, birds, and other creatures. Some of the great central pillars possess features that suggest highly stylized human forms, including arms and hands. Whatever these structures meant, they mattered enough for people to spend considerable effort creating them. That sentence is easy to say. The effort is harder to feel. There was no truck waiting beside the quarry, no powered cutting equipment, no crane, no steel cable, no printed engineering plan. A large piece of limestone had to be identified and worked with the tools and techniques available at the time. Once shaped sufficiently, it had to be moved from the quarry area toward the place where it would stand. We do not know the precise procedure used for every pillar, and there is no reason to invent one. But physics gives us the problem. Stone has weight. Ground has friction. People become tired. Materials used for hauling or leverage have limits. A successful method, therefore, requires practical knowledge, coordination, and enough people doing compatible things at approximately the right time. If 20 people pull in 20 slightly different directions, the stone remains remarkably unimpressed by their enthusiasm. Coordination matters. And coordination immediately opens a social question. Why were people doing this? A modern construction crew can be organized through wages, contracts, companies, regulations, and professional hierarchies. None of those familiar institutions can simply be projected backward onto Göbekli Tepe. Yet labor still had to happen. People needed reasons to participate. Food had to be available while work was performed. Knowledge had to be transmitted. Tasks had to be coordinated. Some form of social expectation must have connected individual effort to a larger purpose. The monument therefore begins long before the stone rises. It begins inside relationships. This is what makes monumental architecture so useful archaeologically. A pillar is not merely a pillar. It is evidence of invisible behavior. Someone knew where useful stone could be found. Someone knew how to work it. People had enough shared purpose to contribute labor. People could gather in sufficient numbers. And the activity continued, rather than collapsing, after the first inconvenient afternoon. The carvings deepen the mystery. Wild animals appear prominently at Göbekli Tepe, sometimes rendered with considerable care. Their precise meanings are unknown. They may have carried symbolic, ritual, social, or cosmological significance, but we do not possess the explanatory system that made them understandable to their makers. This is where restraint becomes difficult. A snake invites interpretation. A bird invites interpretation. A fox invites interpretation. Arrange them on stones more than 11,000 years old, and modern people naturally begin looking for a code. Some interpretations have attempted to connect imagery at Göbekli Tepe with astronomical observations or particular celestial events. Others emphasize ritual, social identity, relationships with animals, death, or cosmology. Debate is normal. The problem begins when interpretation becomes translation without a key. We cannot simply look at an animal carving and confidently announce what it meant to the person who made it. The builders left no dictionary. The symbols belonged to a cultural world that no longer exists. That makes Göbekli Tepe a perfect example of the difference between lost knowledge and lost technology. We know the builders possessed knowledge. We can see its products. What we have lost is much of the meaning. Perhaps a particular image referred to a story everyone knew. Perhaps it marked a group identity. Perhaps it had several meanings depending on context. The frustrating answer is that we cannot know with certainty. To the people gathering there, however, much of this may have been obvious. That is easy to forget. Ancient monuments become mysterious because we arrive late. A doorway inside your own home is not mysterious because you know where it leads. Remove the building around it, remove every sign, erase the language of the people who built it, Wait 10,000 years, and the same doorway becomes an archaeological puzzle. Göbekli Tepe has endured that process on an extraordinary scale. The original voices disappeared. The stones remained, and because the stones are impressive, the silence around them feels unusually loud. One of the most important corrections to older popular descriptions of the site is that Göbekli Tepe should not be imagined simply as an isolated temple mysteriously standing in an otherwise empty landscape. Archaeological understanding of the broader region has developed considerably. Göbekli Tepe belonged to a wider, early, Neolithic world containing other sites, communities, shared practices, and related forms of monumental architecture. That makes it less suitable as evidence for a lone group of survivors arriving from a destroyed civilization. It makes it more useful for understanding local social development. People in this region were already connected to a changing cultural landscape. They were experimenting with new ways of gathering, building, staying, and organizing. The old popular slogan that religion came before agriculture captures only part of a much more complicated transition. Human societies did not move through a tidy checklist. First hunting, then religion, then farming, then villages, then civilization. Different developments overlapped. People could gather seasonally at important places while remaining partly mobile. Some communities could become more sedentary while still relying heavily on wild resources. Cultivation could begin without immediately producing fully domesticated crops. Structures could become substantial before anything resembling a later city existed. The boundaries blur, and once they blur, a more interesting possibility appears. Maybe one of the major technologies behind early civilization was not a tool at all. Maybe it was the ability to organize larger numbers of people. A small group of close relatives has built-in reasons to cooperate. Everyone knows everyone. Reputation travels quickly. Food sharing can be personal. Conflict occurs inside relationships with long histories. As groups become larger, cooperation becomes harder. There are more strangers, more competing interests, more opportunities for disagreement, more questions about who contributes and who receives. A shared ritual system can help solve some of those problems. It creates common expectations, common places, common times to gather, common symbols, possibly common identities extending beyond a single household. This does not mean Göbekli Tepe was built simply because humans needed social management, nor can we reduce religion to an administrative invention. But communal ritual and communal labor can reinforce one another. People gather because the place matters. The place matters partly because people gather. Labor invested in it makes it more significant. Its significance justifies more labor. A temporary gathering place becomes a tradition. Tradition acquires architecture. Architecture makes returning easier to organize. Soon the place has a history longer than any individual life. This is one way permanence begins. Not necessarily with a house, with repetition. Return to the same place often enough, and the place starts accumulating memory. Someone was buried nearby. A structure was rebuilt. A ceremony was performed. A child first attended years ago and now arrives with children of their own. The site becomes part of collective identity. Even if people still move through the wider landscape, they now possess a fixed point. Fixed points change human behavior. Eventually, in many parts of Southwest Asia, fixed points became increasingly substantial settlements. The transition towards sedentary life and agriculture unfolded over millennia, with different communities following different paths. There was no committee that decided humanity should stop hunting and invent farming. The process involved countless local decisions. People collected wild cereals. They processed them, returned to productive patches, manipulated environments. Eventually, cultivation became increasingly important in some places. Over generations, human selection altered plants. Animals too entered new relationships with people. The result would become one of the most consequential changes in human history, and one of the least comfortable. Agriculture is often introduced as progress because, in the long run, it supported larger populations and eventually cities, states, writing, and enormous technological development. But an individual living through the transition did not receive civilization as compensation for a difficult harvest. The immediate exchange could be harsher. Farming requires work on a schedule. A wild resource can sometimes be abandoned when it becomes poor. A planted field has already absorbed labor. The field needs attention. Plants cannot follow you if you decide the valley is inconvenient. A crop ties future calories to present geography. That relationship creates commitment, and commitment creates vulnerability. Once people depend heavily on cultivated food, weather becomes political in a new way. Rain is no longer simply uncomfortable. It can determine whether months of work succeed. Too little rain is dangerous. Too much can also be dangerous. A storm arriving at the wrong moment can damage crops. Pests can concentrate around fields. Plant disease can move through a crop. A harvest can fail across an entire community because many households are depending on similar resources. This is the paradox of efficiency. Specialization allows people to produce more. It can also make them dependent on fewer systems. The same problem appears with permanent settlement. A mobile group carries fewer possessions partly because everything must remain movable. Settled people can accumulate heavy, grinding stones, storage containers, building materials, tools, food reserves, objects that would be absurd to carry repeatedly across long distances become practical. Comfort increases in some ways. So does attachment. Then the roof leaks. Permanent houses require permanent repairs. Walls deteriorate. Floors accumulate dirt. Food attracts rodents. Waste accumulates near people. Animals living close to humans create new sanitary problems. Smoke from indoor fires can become persistent. A settlement that grows successfully becomes more crowded. The solution to mobility creates the problem of maintenance. And maintenance never finishes. This is civilization in one of its least glamorous forms. Repairing things. A wall built last year is work this year. A storage area needs protection. A water source must remain accessible. Paths need to function. The larger the settlement becomes, the more people depend on systems no single household controls completely. That dependence changes social life. Stored food is particularly important. For mobile communities, wealth must often remain portable or accessible across a landscape. Agricultural surplus can sit in one place. That is extremely useful. It means food harvested during one season can support people later. It provides insurance. It allows some people to spend time on activities other than immediate food acquisition. But stored food creates a new question. Who owns it? A pile of grain is future survival made visible. Everyone can understand its value. That means it can be shared, exchanged, inherited, counted, protected, stolen, controlled. The technology of storage, therefore, creates social possibilities far beyond the container itself. Surplus can support specialists. It can support communal feasts. It can help communities survive poor seasons. It can also become a basis of inequality. Someone who controls access to stored resources possesses a kind of power that is difficult to create when food is widely dispersed across the landscape. This does not mean the first storage pit produced the first tyrant. Social inequality developed differently in different communities and over long periods. But the material conditions for new forms of authority were changing. More people were staying in one place. More labor was invested in that place. More resources could be accumulated there. Leaving became expensive, and when leaving becomes expensive, the person who controls the place becomes more important. Permanent settlement also changes conflict. If two mobile groups disagree severely, separation may sometimes provide a solution. A settled farmer cannot easily move the field. The house is here, the grain is here. The ancestors may be here. The useful water is here. So disputes have to be managed differently. Rules become more important. Boundaries become more important. Inheritance becomes more important. Who belongs to which household matters. Who has access to which resource matters. A temporary arrangement can slowly become custom simply because people keep needing the same problem solved. This is how ordinary inconvenience can harden into institution. One season, a community agrees on when certain land can be used. The arrangement works. The next generation inherits the practice. Eventually, nobody remembers the first argument. They only know the rule. Civilization accumulates these forgotten solutions. Some become law, some become ritual, some become architecture, some become hierarchy, and many survive long after the original problem has changed. There is a cost to all of this that archaeology can make strangely invisible. A larger settlement means more human bodies close together. That changes disease ecology. Waste accumulates. Water can become contaminated. Food stores attract animals that thrive around humans. Domesticated animals increase close contact between species. The epidemiological consequences of settled and agricultural life developed over long periods and varied with population size and local conditions, but the broad direction is important. Living together creates biological opportunities as well as social ones. Pathogens benefit from crowds. The village is a human achievement. It is also a habitat for organisms other than humans. This is one of the recurring contradictions of civilization. People build systems to make life more secure. Those systems create new forms of insecurity. Settlement protects accumulated resources. It also concentrates them. Agriculture produces more food. It also concentrates risk. Storage protects against shortage. It also attracts theft and pests. Larger communities offer more relationships and shared labor. They also produce more conflict, waste, and disease. None of these problems mean settlement was a mistake. People repeatedly adopted and expanded these ways of living because they offered real advantages. But progress is not the removal of difficulty. It is often an exchange of difficulties. And over thousands of years, those exchanges produced something new. Villages became larger. Agriculture intensified. Domesticated plants and animals became increasingly central. Networks of exchange expanded. Craft skills developed. Some people acquired specialized roles. Social differences became more visible. Eventually, in regions such as Mesopotamia, Settlements grew into urban systems unlike anything earlier humans had experienced. Now thousands of people could live close together. Most would not know one another personally. Food could arrive from fields beyond the immediate settlement. Specialists could spend much of their lives doing work unrelated to producing their own calories. Administrators could count resources. Temples could coordinate wealth. Political authority could extend across settlements. Writing would eventually make memory external in an entirely new way. A spoken instruction dies if nobody remembers it. A written account can survive the person who created it. That changes civilization profoundly. Debt can outlive the conversation in which it was agreed. Ownership can be recorded. Tax can be counted. A ruler's name can survive the ruler. And for the first time, history begins producing the kind of evidence modern historians find reassuring. Names, dates, transactions, wars, lists, laws. We finally begin hearing people speak across time, but writing creates an illusion of its own. Because written history is so much more detailed, everything before it can look empty. It was not empty. It was simply less able to speak to us. Göbekli Tepe sits near that enormous silence. Its builders were separated from the first writing systems by millennia. They could not explain themselves to us in sentences, so we interpret stone. And where interpretation becomes uncertain, modern stories rush in. This is where the idea of a lost advanced civilization returns. If monumental architecture appeared earlier than expected, perhaps civilization itself must have appeared earlier. If civilization appeared earlier, perhaps there was something before Göbekli Tepe. If something existed before it, perhaps the younger Dryas destroyed it. If the survivors carried knowledge forward, perhaps they built the site. Each step sounds possible when spoken quickly. Together, they create a story for which the archaeological evidence is missing. The important word is not impossible. It is unsupported. There is a large difference. Archaeology routinely discovers things that earlier scholars did not expect. Göbekli Tepe itself is evidence of that. Ancient DNA revealed human relationships that would once have seemed extraordinary. Submerged archaeology has uncovered landscapes where modern maps show only sea. The responsible response to those discoveries is not to declare that anything can be true. It is to become more careful about what the evidence actually requires. Göbekli Tepe requires capable local people. It requires organization, technical skill, shared purpose, symbolic systems, long-term activity. It does not require electricity. It does not require a global empire. It does not require survivors from Atlantis. And this distinction protects something important. The achievement belongs to the people who made it. They do not become more impressive if we replace them with imaginary teachers. They become less visible. There is another reason Göbekli Tepe matters to the story of lost civilizations. It demonstrates how quickly our assumptions can become outdated. For generations, people created simplified narratives of human progress, partly because the available evidence seemed to support them. Then, new sites were excavated. Dating improved. New technologies appeared. Ancient DNA opened another archive. Underwater landscapes became more accessible. The story changed. It will change again. There are, undoubtedly, archaeological discoveries still beneath fields, forests, deserts, caves, sediments, and oceans. Some may force major revisions. But revision is not the same thing as vindication of every old legend. If, tomorrow, archaeologists discover a previously unknown settlement 12,000 years old, we should examine that settlement. Its tools, its buildings, its food, its burials, its chronology, its environment. We should not immediately give it a name borrowed from Plato. That habit, taking a genuine discovery and forcing it into an older myth, is exactly how Atlantis eventually escaped from philosophy and began migrating around the planet. And Atlantis is where the story changes character. Until now, we have dealt mainly with vanished worlds that are physically grounded, drowned landscapes, changing climates, extinct animals, lost human populations, and early societies whose complexity surprised modern archaeology. Atlantis belongs to another category. It begins with a text, a very famous one. From there, it becomes a place people try to find, then a civilization people try to reconstruct. Then, much later, part of an enormous modern mythology involving forgotten technologies, lost continents, and repeated ages of humanity. And somewhere along that journey, another lost land joins it. Lemuria. Unlike Atlantis, Lemuria began not with an ancient philosopher, but with 19th century science. Then the science changed. The lost continent remained. That survival tells us something important about lost worlds. Sometimes, civilizations disappear and leave myths behind. And sometimes the myth appears first, then spends centuries looking for a civilization to inhabit. Atlantis enters the story in a very different way from Göbekli Tepe. There is no excavation trench at the beginning, no buried settlement, no drowned harbour discovered first and named later. There is a text. In Plato's dialogues Timaeus and Critias, written in the 4th century BCE, Atlantis appears as a powerful island society beyond the familiar Greek world. It is wealthy, ambitious, militarily formidable, and eventually morally corrupted. It attacks an idealized ancient Athens, is defeated, and then disappears in a catastrophic destruction associated with earthquakes and floods. That is the basic outline. And almost everything that happened to Atlantis afterward grew from one problem. People wanted to know whether Plato meant it literally. Plato was a philosopher, not a modern archaeologist, and the story of Atlantis appears inside works concerned with politics, morality, ideal states, and the consequences of corruption. Many scholars, therefore, read Atlantis primarily within that philosophical and literary context. But the story is written with enough geographical and historical detail to invite another possibility. What if there really was a place? That question turned Atlantis from a philosophical story into a search target. Once that happens, the rules change. A story can survive perfectly well without coordinates. A lost continent needs a map. So Atlantis began moving. Different writers and researchers have placed it in or near the Atlantic Ocean, the Mediterranean, the Aegean, Iberia, North Africa, the Caribbean, Antarctica, and various other locations. The geography changes because the evidence never forces one answer. That is one of the clearest warning signs in lost civilization research. When a theory can move almost anywhere and still survive, the theory is usually being protected from the evidence rather than tested by it. But the attraction is obvious. Atlantis solves several human desires at once. It offers a civilization older than familiar history. It offers grandeur. It offers moral decline. It offers catastrophe. And most importantly, it offers explanation. If you find an ancient monument that seems too impressive for your assumptions about its builders, Atlantis can become the missing teacher. If you find an unusual artifact, Atlantis can become the missing source. If you find a flood story, Atlantis can become the lost world remembered by the flood. The theory grows stronger in imagination each time another mystery is added to it. But this is also where logic begins to loosen. Suppose a megalithic structure is discovered. That is evidence for the people who built that structure. It is not evidence for Atlantis unless some independent connection exists. Suppose a submerged settlement is found. That is evidence for a submerged settlement. Its location, date, material culture, and environmental context must still be examined. The fact that it is underwater does not make it Atlantean. This sounds obvious when stated slowly. Popular history often moves much faster. A dramatic image appears. An ancient date is mentioned. A flood is added. Then the word Atlantis arrives before the archaeology has had a chance to speak. That habit is powerful because Atlantis is not really one place anymore. It is a container. Different generations fill it with different anxieties. For Plato, it can function as a story about power and moral decline. For later occult writers, it becomes part of a hidden history of humanity. For modern alternative archaeology, it can become a technologically advanced Ice Age civilization. For popular entertainment, it becomes whatever civilization was needed to build the impossible machine before disappearing beneath the sea. The story is remarkably adaptable. That adaptability explains why Atlantis survives so easily. It can absorb almost anything, but a story that absorbs everything also becomes difficult to test. If no ruins are found, the catastrophe was total. If ruins are found elsewhere, Atlantis was larger than expected. If the technology is absent, it was made from materials that did not survive. If the writing is absent, the records were destroyed. If archaeology disagrees, archaeology has not looked in the right place. At some point, the explanation becomes immune to contradiction. That is the difference between mystery and an unfalsifiable claim. A real mystery has boundaries. We know what evidence is missing. We know what kind of discovery could change the picture. An unfalsifiable claim simply changes shape every time the evidence refuses to cooperate. Atlantis did not remain alone in this expanding world of lost continents. In the 19th century, another lost land appeared, Lemuria. Its origin is especially revealing because it did not begin as occult mythology. It began as a scientific attempt to solve a problem. Before plate tectonics was understood, naturalists struggled to explain why related animals and plants appeared on landmasses now separated by large oceans. One proposed solution was that some regions had once been connected by now submerged land bridges. In the 1860s, zoologist Philip Sclater proposed a hypothetical lost landmass involving Madagascar and India to help explain the distribution of lemurs and related animals. He called it Lemuria. At the time, this was not a claim about crystal cities or a vanished master race. It was an attempt to explain biogeography with the geological knowledge then available. Science later changed. The development of continental drift and eventually plate tectonics provided a far more powerful explanation for how continents moved and how formerly connected landmasses became separated. The scientific need for Lemuria disappeared. But Lemuria did not. This is where the story becomes almost more interesting than if the continent had been real. A discarded scientific hypothesis migrated into another intellectual world. Occult writers adopted it. The lost land acquired inhabitants. those inhabitants acquired spiritual significance. Lemuria stopped being a geological bridge and became a civilization. The transformation shows how easily authority transfers. A concept begins inside science. Later, science rejects it, but the old scientific vocabulary remains attached to the idea. To a later reader, the term can still sound as if science once discovered a lost continent and then mysteriously abandoned it. What really happened is much less conspiratorial. The explanatory model improved. But explanations do not all die when their scientific usefulness ends. Some become stories, and stories often have better survival instincts than obsolete hypotheses. This is where Helena, Petrovna, Blavatsky, and Theosophy enter the picture. Theosophy developed in the late 19th century as an esoteric movement combining elements drawn from Western occultism, Eastern religious concepts, as interpreted by 19th century writers, spiritual evolution, reincarnation, hidden masters, and elaborate cosmic histories. Within theosophical thought, humanity was divided into successive stages known as root races. 7 became an organizing number. Different root races were associated with different epochs, forms of humanity, and in later theosophical elaborations, places such as Lemuria and Atlantis. This is one of the most important moments in the entire history of the modern lost civilization idea, because now several older traditions become fused into a new system. Ancient, cyclical time, Atlantis. A 19th century hypothetical continent. Spiritual evolution. Ideas about successive forms of humanity. And the number 7. That mixture can later be mistaken for something far older than it is. When modern people hear that humanity is supposedly the 7th civilization, it can sound as if many ancient cultures preserved the same sequence independently. They did not. The Hindu Yugas form one tradition. Greek ages of man form another. Mesoamerican Suns form another. The 7 root races belong to modern theosophy. Those systems can be compared as examples of repeated ages, but they should not be merged into one ancient global chronology. The number 7 is especially misleading because it appears sacred or symbolically important in many religious traditions. 7 days, 7 heavens, 7 planets in older cosmologies, 7 stages, 7 generations. That does not mean every occurrence of 7 refers to the same hidden historical system. Humans reuse meaningful numbers. The same number can carry different meanings in different cultures. Theosophy gave 7 a specific role in a modern esoteric theory of human development. That is not archaeology. There is also an uncomfortable part of the root race tradition that should not be softened. The language of successive races developed within a 19th century world already saturated with racial classification and hierarchy. Theosophical racial ideas were not identical to every form of scientific racism circulating at the time, but they participated in the same broad intellectual environment in which humanity was frequently arranged into ranked developmental categories. Later, esoteric and racial ideologies sometimes borrowed or transformed such ideas in disturbing ways. So, when the root race concept appears in modern lost civilization content as a harmless ancient teaching, an important piece of its history disappears. It was not a neutral prehistoric map. It was a modern construction, shaped by the assumptions of its period. This does not mean everyone interested in theosophy or Atlantis shares those assumptions. It means the history of the idea matters. And once we see that history, something becomes much clearer. The modern lost civilization narrative is not one ancient tradition preserved intact. It is a collage, a little Plato, a little biblical catastrophe, a little Hindu cyclical time, a little Mesoamerican cosmic destruction, a little 19th century geology, a large amount of occult synthesis. Then, in the 20th and 21st centuries, archaeology, astronomy, ancient catastrophes, and new discoveries are added. The collage becomes so familiar that it can feel ancient. That is how myths modernize. They borrow authority from whatever a culture currently trusts. In one era, that authority is scripture. In another, classical philosophy. Later, geology. Later still, genetics, astronomy, or quantum physics. The vocabulary changes. The emotional structure remains. There was a greater world before ours. Something destroyed it. Survivors preserved fragments of knowledge. We inherited the fragments without understanding them. And if we can reconstruct the pattern, perhaps we can discover who we really are. That structure is extraordinarily attractive because it gives meaning to historical discontinuity. Why do civilizations rise so suddenly? Because someone taught them. Why do myths resemble one another? Because they remember the same event. Why are some ancient achievements surprising? Because knowledge was inherited. Why is the evidence incomplete? Because catastrophe destroyed it. Every mystery is pulled toward one answer. The problem is that history rarely gives one answer that easily. Take the rise of agriculture. It did not happen once in one place and spread from a single hidden civilization to everyone else. Different forms of plant and animal domestication developed in different parts of the world. Take monumental architecture. It appears in different societies under different conditions. Take astronomy. Humans everywhere have access to the sky. Different cultures do not need a shared lost teacher to notice lunar cycles, solstices, seasonal stars, or eclipses. Similarity can arise because human beings share similar brains and face similar problems. That explanation is sometimes less exciting. It is also often stronger. There is another reason lost civilization theories flourish whenever archaeology discovers something unexpected. People confuse changing knowledge with suppressed knowledge. Archaeology revises itself constantly. Dates move, models fail, new sites overturn old expectations. That is not evidence that experts were hiding the truth. It is what a functioning discipline looks like. Göbekli Tepe changed assumptions about early monumentality. Ancient DNA changed assumptions about human population history. Underwater archaeology changed assumptions about prehistoric coastlines. Each discovery made the past more complicated. None required a secret committee to approve complexity. The problem is that revision can look embarrassing from the outside. A textbook says one thing. A discovery changes it. Someone asks, why were we told the old story? Because the old story was built from the evidence available at the time. History becomes dangerous when uncertainty is mistaken for deception. That does not mean institutions are never resistant to new ideas. They are human institutions. Researchers can be conservative. Careers can influence debates. Bad assumptions can last too long. But extraordinary historical claims still need evidence that survives criticism. The remedy for weak scholarship is stronger scholarship, not immunity from evidence. Atlantis has endured, partly because it benefits from never having to pass that test completely. Every generation gets a new Atlantis candidate. A geological formation resembles walls. An underwater anomaly resembles a road. A circular landscape resembles Plato's description. A volcanic island has evidence of catastrophic destruction. An ancient city lies near a flood zone. Each candidate can be interesting. Some are genuinely important archaeological sites, but matching a few features does not create identity. Human settlements repeatedly occur near water. Cities repeatedly suffer earthquakes. Islands repeatedly experience volcanic disaster. Large societies repeatedly become involved in warfare. A story can resemble history without being a record of one specific event. The most famous candidate, often connected loosely with Atlantis, is the Bronze Age Aegean world, particularly the volcanic destruction associated with Thera, modern Santorini, and the Minoan civilization. The eruption was real. The Minoans were real. The catastrophe was enormous. But the correspondence with Plato's Atlantis is not exact, and scholars debate whether such historical events may have influenced later traditions, or whether Plato constructed the story primarily for philosophical purposes. The responsible position is not to force certainty. A real catastrophe can inspire a story without being identical to it. And a fictional story can contain realistic catastrophe without requiring one specific prototype. This distinction becomes essential when we return to the Younger Dryas. The climatic event is real. The question of an extraterrestrial trigger is debated. An advanced civilization destroyed by that event is another claim entirely. Atlantis is often inserted into the gap between those statements, but each additional claim requires its own evidence. A catastrophe does not automatically supply a civilization. A civilization does not automatically supply advanced technology. Advanced technology does not automatically supply global influence. And global influence does not automatically explain every ancient monument. Once the chain is separated, the mystery becomes smaller, but it becomes more durable. We are left with questions that evidence can actually answer. How complex were late Pleistocene societies? How extensive were coastal settlements on now submerged land? How early did large-scale ritual gathering develop? How did knowledge move between communities? What kinds of social organization existed before writing? How much prehistoric archaeology remains underwater or undiscovered? These questions are not disappointing. They are enormous, but they do not promise one magical civilization behind everything. This may be why Atlantis continues to outperform real archaeology in popular imagination. Real archaeology gives partial answers. Atlantis gives a complete one. Complete answers are comforting, especially when the past is full of silence. There is another subtle reason. A lost super-civilization flatters us. If ancient people once possessed extraordinary knowledge and lost it, then modern humanity may not be the first to reach a high level of development. Our civilization becomes part of a grand cycle. We become heirs, possibly survivors, possibly the next society approaching the same mistake. That gives history dramatic symmetry. Rise, corruption, destruction, reset, rise again. The pattern resembles the old ages of man and destroyed suns we encountered earlier, except now the language has changed. The gods are replaced with catastrophe. Cosmic ages become technological civilizations. Sacred cycles become geological resets. Myth has put on scientific clothing. Sometimes that clothing fits. Often It does not. And this brings us directly to the hardest test in the entire story. Suppose we stop arguing about names. Forget Atlantis. Forget Lemuria. Forget root races. Ask the strongest possible version of the question. Could a technologically advanced civilization really have existed deep in prehistory and then vanished so completely that archaeology has missed it? That is a fair question. It should not be mocked. It should be tested, because every civilization leaves more than buildings. It changes the world around it. The larger and more technologically intensive the civilization, the more difficult those changes become to erase. A wooden house can rot. A city can collapse. A road can disappear beneath vegetation. But mines behave differently. Quarries behave differently. Metallurgy behaves differently. Mass production behaves differently. Domesticated species behave differently. Pollution behaves differently. Large-scale landscape engineering behaves differently. Civilization leaves consequences, and those consequences may survive long after the stories are gone. So, the final question is no longer whether ancient people told us there were worlds before ours. They did. Nor whether real human worlds vanished. They did. The question now is narrower. If one of those worlds had been technologically comparable to a later civilization, what would we expect to find? And how much could time really erase? Suppose, for a moment, that we strip away every name. No Atlantis, no Lemuria, no root races, no inherited myth, just the strongest version of the question. Could a technologically advanced civilization have existed deep in prehistory and then disappeared so completely that we have failed to recognize it? The only useful way to approach that question is to stop asking what ruins might look dramatic and start asking what complex societies inevitably do to the physical world. Civilization does not exist in empty space. It extracts, builds, moves, consumes, discards, redirects, burns, cuts, digs, concentrates. And the more technologically intensive a society becomes, the harder it is to hide all of those actions at once. A small settlement can vanish almost completely. A wooden village can rot. A camp can leave little more than stone flakes, hearth traces, and changes in soil chemistry. A coastal site can disappear beneath rising water. A tropical settlement can be damaged by vegetation, humidity, erosion, and later human activity. But a large-scale technological civilization creates a different category of evidence. Start with stone. Buildings can collapse, but quarries are difficult to erase. If a society constructs large numbers of stone structures, that stone has to come from somewhere. Extraction changes the landscape. Cuts remain. Faces of rock are altered. Waste fragments accumulate. Transport routes develop. The monument can disappear while the wound that supplied it survives. The same is true of mining, only more extreme. Metal does not appear because a clever person wants it, or has to be found, extracted, moved, crushed, processed, smelted, worked. Each step consumes labor and energy. Mining produces spoil. Smelting produces residues. Large-scale metal production leaves chemical signatures and physical debris that can survive long after finished objects have corroded or been recycled. This creates a very important limit on speculation. A civilization with advanced metallurgy cannot be hidden merely by saying its buildings were destroyed. The industrial chain behind the metal matters more than the surviving sword. Modern people often focus on finished artifacts because they are easy to display. Archaeologists are equally interested in production. Where was the material obtained? How was it processed? What waste was produced? How widely was it distributed? Who had access to it? Technology is not one mysterious object. It is infrastructure, and infrastructure multiplies evidence. A single unusual artifact can be misunderstood. A technological system is harder to misunderstand because it repeats itself. If thousands of people use a material across generations, traces appear in many places. Workshops, waste, trade routes, repair sites, broken pieces, burials, settlements, production zones. The larger the society, the more independent traces it should create. That does not mean archaeologists would immediately understand all of them. Misinterpretation happens. Sites are misdated. Objects are assigned incorrect functions. Old assumptions survive longer than they should. But a civilization operating at large scale should not depend for its existence on one ambiguous stone or one controversial object. It should leave a pattern. That word matters. Pattern. Archaeology becomes strong when different forms of evidence point in the same direction. Settlement distribution, chronology, material culture, environmental change, burials, diet, technology, trade. A large claim needs convergence. Without convergence, the temptation is to build an enormous history on a very small foundation. And there are certain kinds of civilization that would be especially difficult to hide. Consider urbanism. A true city is not simply a large collection of houses. It creates demands: water, food, waste disposal, construction material, movement, storage, administration, roads, markets, defensive systems in some cases, cemeteries, peripheral settlements, agricultural support. A city has an ecological footprint much larger than its walls. Even if the central buildings disappear, the surrounding system can remain visible. People have to eat every day. That means food must come from somewhere. Fields may be created. Forests may be cut. Animals may be managed. Storage systems may develop. Transport routes emerge between production zones and consumers. A large permanent population, therefore, alters the surrounding landscape simply by remaining alive. This is one reason claims of a vast advanced Ice Age city require more than a submerged geometric shape. If a city existed, where was its food produced? Where were its raw materials obtained? Where are the settlements connected to it? What technological tradition preceded it? What happened to the population afterward? Where are the repeated material signatures? One city does not float independently in history. It belongs to a system. This becomes even more important when claims expand from city to civilization. A civilization has scale, multiple communities, networks, shared technologies, exchange, political or ritual relationships. Patterns repeat. If all evidence rests on a single anomalous site, then what is being proposed may be extraordinary locally, but it is not yet evidence of a civilization in the wider sense. There is also the question of domestication. One of the clearest ways humans transform the world is by changing other species. Agriculture does not merely leave fields. Over generations, human selection changes plants. Seeds change. Growth patterns change. Animals change in body size, behavior, reproduction, and distribution. Domesticated species move with people. They spread beyond natural ranges. A large agricultural civilization, therefore, leaves biological consequences. These can survive after buildings vanish. Pollen records may change. Plant remains change. Animal bones change. Land use alters erosion. Fire regimes shift. Soil changes. A civilization can become part of ecology. The larger it becomes, the harder it is to separate the society from the environment it modified. This brings us to one of the most interesting thought experiments in the subject. What would happen if our own civilization disappeared? Not gradually declined, disappeared tomorrow. At first, our presence would remain overwhelming. Cities, roads, vehicles, dams, power lines, plastic, concrete, glass, steel, landfills, mines, ports, tunnels, industrial agriculture. But time would begin working immediately. Vegetation would enter cracks. Water would enter buildings. Roofs would fail. Metal would corrode. Wood would rot. Storms would dismantle exposed structures. Rivers would begin reclaiming engineered channels where maintenance stopped. Some dams would fail. Sediment would accumulate. Coastal structures would erode. After centuries, many recognizable features of modern life would be badly damaged. After thousands of years, the surface would be transformed far more dramatically. A future observer might not find a recognizable laptop. Most books would be gone. A wooden house could disappear almost entirely. Many roads would be buried or eroded. Entire neighborhoods might be reduced to strange concentrations of artificial material. But that observer would not conclude that nothing unusual had happened. Our civilization has changed the planet too extensively. Mining alone would be difficult to explain away. Humans have removed enormous quantities of material from the ground and concentrated others in unnatural places. We have moved elements through industrial processes. We have created vast deposits of artificial materials. We have altered rivers, changed sediment movement, redistributed species across continents, changed atmospheric chemistry, left radioactive signatures from nuclear activity, produced plastics that enter sediments. Our civilization may not remain recognizable in the way we recognize it now, but some form of technological event would remain visible. That thought experiment creates a reasonable comparison. If a prehistoric civilization existed with industrial capacities comparable to ours, we should expect more than architecture. We should expect planetary, or at least large, regional consequences. And at present, that evidence is absent. This does not prove that no sophisticated society existed before known early civilizations. The word sophisticated is doing too much work there. A society can be socially, technically, or intellectually complex without being industrial. That distinction matters enormously. A maritime society can possess extraordinary navigation and leave few large stone monuments. A forest society can manage plants and landscapes in sophisticated ways, while leaving archaeology that is difficult to recognize. A community can maintain long-distance exchange without cities. People can develop advanced knowledge of medicine, seasons, animal behavior, and materials without producing anything resembling a modern industrial signature. So when someone says, perhaps an advanced civilization existed, the next question should be, advanced in what way? If advanced means capable of navigating long distances, possible evidence looks one way. If it means building large communal monuments, we know prehistoric societies could do that. If it means complex astronomy based on long observation of the sky, that does not require an industrial state. If it means electric grids, mechanized industry, or global mining, the expected evidence becomes radically different. The phrase advanced civilization often hides this distinction. It allows modern technology to be projected backward while avoiding the consequences modern technology would leave. There is a broader preservation problem that deserves equal attention. Archaeology is not equally good everywhere. Dry caves can preserve organic material that disappears completely in humid soil. Frozen ground can preserve bodies, clothing, and food. Waterlogged environments can preserve wood under the right conditions. Acidic soils can destroy bone. Tropical environments can damage structures rapidly. River valleys can bury sites beneath meters of sediment. Later, cities can cover earlier settlements. Coastlines can erode. Sea level rise can submerge entire regions. A person looking only at surviving stone sites is therefore looking through a preservation filter. The filter matters. Imagine two communities of similar complexity. One builds heavily in stone in a dry environment. The other builds with timber, fiber, reeds, and earth in a humid environment. 10,000 years later, the first may look monumental. The second may look nearly invisible. The difference in survival is not necessarily a difference in intelligence. This creates what we might call the bias of stone. Stone-built societies appear loudly in the archaeological record. Perishable societies whisper. And modern audiences naturally equate loud evidence with higher achievement. But some of the most important human technologies are perishable. Rope, baskets, nets, clothing, boats, wooden containers, handles, shelters, composite tools. A person can build an entire survival system from materials that archaeology struggles to preserve. This is especially important for coastal populations. A society skilled in fishing, navigation, and marine travel might invest heavily in materials with poor preservation. Wooden vessels disappear. Rope disappears. Sails disappear. Fish processing equipment can be subtle. If the coastline itself is later submerged, the problem doubles. The technology vanishes, and the landscape containing it becomes difficult to reach. That means submerged prehistoric coastlines may still contain major surprises. There is every reason to expect future discoveries. Some could change our understanding of migration. Some could reveal more permanent settlement than expected. Some could show maritime adaptation developing earlier than previously known. Some could expose networks connecting regions that today seem naturally separated. All of that is possible within ordinary archaeology. And it is important not to weaken those possibilities by attaching Atlantis to them too early. The real unknown is already substantial. There is another category of evidence that is even easier to lose. Knowledge that leaves no object. A community might possess detailed understanding of weather patterns, animal migration, medicinal plants, navigation by stars, currents, seasonal winds, food preservation, social diplomacy. None of these must produce a monument. If the community disappears, the knowledge can disappear with it. This is genuine lost technology in the broadest sense. Not machines, procedures. A method can die in one generation if no one learns it. A route can disappear if nobody travels it. A plant use can be forgotten if specialists die before teaching others. A language can vanish and carry technical vocabulary with it. Human history is full of this kind of loss. It is almost certainly far more common than the loss of spectacular machines, and it suggests a different kind of prehistoric sophistication. Imagine a navigator who can cross open water reliably with no compass, no map, and no written chart. That skill is extraordinary. But if it depends on memorized stars, swells, wind, cloud behavior, bird movement, and oral instruction, almost the entire system can disappear without leaving a device. To a later society, the voyage may look impossible. The temptation is then to invent hidden technology. But the missing technology may have been embodied in a trained person. This is one of the recurring mistakes modern people make with ancient societies. We assume intelligence must be visible as machinery. It does not. Human beings were capable long before industrial tools existed. The more useful question is often not, what machine did they have? It is, what did they know how to do? That distinction helps explain some genuinely surprising achievements without requiring a lost technological age. Large stones can be moved with organization, leverage, friction management, prepared routes, and labor. Long distances can be navigated with environmental knowledge. Seasonal cycles can be tracked with careful observation. Food can be stored using techniques developed across generations. None of these are simple. None require electricity. And when knowledge becomes specialized, it can disappear. Civilization depends on chains of instruction. A potter trains another potter. A builder trains another builder. A healer trains another healer. A navigator trains another navigator. Break enough chains, and the society can lose capabilities even while people survive. This can happen surprisingly quickly. Historical societies have lost technical methods when trade networks collapsed, specialized workshops disappeared, or political systems changed. The object may remain. The ability to reproduce it does not. That is a real form of regression, but it should not be confused with a global technological reset for which no production infrastructure survives. Scale again becomes the deciding factor. A local craft can vanish almost invisibly. A continent-wide industrial system cannot. There is also a tendency to underestimate how much archaeology has already recovered from very deep time. Prehistoric people did not leave us nothing. Stone technologies change in recognizable sequences. Human remains reveal diet, disease, movement, and ancestry. Animal bones reveal hunting and domestication. Plant remains reveal subsistence. Sediments record fire and erosion. Ancient DNA reveals population contact. Residues on tools reveal materials processed. Microscopic wear reveals how objects were used. Stable isotopes can reveal aspects of diet and mobility. Modern archaeology increasingly detects things earlier generations of researchers could barely see. This is important because the lost civilization argument sometimes depends on an outdated picture of archaeology, as people brushing dirt from pottery and guessing. The discipline is still imperfect, but the range of evidence has expanded enormously. And, when methods improve, previously invisible behavior becomes visible. Ancient DNA is perhaps the clearest example. For most of archaeology's history, interbreeding between modern humans and Neanderthals could not be demonstrated directly. Then, genetics changed the question. The discovery did not validate every old story about mysterious ancient races. It revealed something specific. That is how genuine surprises usually arrive. They narrow uncertainty rather than making every possibility equally likely. This principle can help us evaluate future discoveries too. Suppose archaeologists find a submerged settlement 12,000 years old. That would be remarkable. We would ask what its inhabitants ate, what tools they made, how permanent the settlement was, whether buildings existed, what connections it had to other communities, what the dating shows. If evidence reveals something unexpected, the historical model changes, but the discovery does not become evidence for a global Ice Age civilization unless additional evidence supports that larger claim. Scale has to be earned. There is still one uncomfortable possibility left. What if a prehistoric society was advanced in ways that leave almost no archaeological signature? That is possible, depending on what advanced means. A society could possess sophisticated oral mathematics, complex social institutions, accurate ecological knowledge, elaborate philosophy, advanced navigation, detailed astronomy, a rich artistic tradition produced mostly in perishable materials. We might recover only fragments. We could underestimate it severely. This is not a loophole in archaeology. It is one of archaeology's genuine limitations. Human complexity is larger than material culture. A person can hold an entire cosmology in memory. A legal system can exist orally. Genealogies can structure politics. Songs can encode geography. A ritual can organize thousands of people without producing a written manual. The absence of writing should never be confused with the absence of thought. This brings us close to the final answer, because once the word civilization is separated from industrial technology, the question changes completely. Could sophisticated human worlds have existed before the first cities we usually learn about? Yes, we already know they did. Could some be much more complex than their surviving archaeology suggests? Certainly. Could substantial prehistoric coastal societies remain undiscovered beneath the sea? Very likely. Could knowledge systems have vanished almost entirely? Absolutely. Could a global technological civilization comparable to a later industrial society disappear without leaving broad physical traces? That is much harder to reconcile with the evidence we have. And that distinction does not diminish the mystery. It removes the weakest part of it. The prehistoric past does not need hidden power plants to be astonishing. It contains other humans who disappeared. Entire ecosystems that disappeared. Landscapes now underwater. Communities whose languages are gone. Technologies preserved only as tiny traces. Social systems we cannot name. Ritual meanings we cannot recover. Thousands upon thousands of complete human lives represented today by a few fragments of stone and bone. That is enough, more than enough. And it gives us a final way to return to the title of this story. If we are not literally the seventh industrial civilization, could we still be living in a seventh world? Only if we stop counting empires. Only if we count what humans actually lose. A biological world, an ecological world, a geographic world, a climatic world, a social world, a cultural world. Then ours. The numbers are not ancient doctrine, they are a way of seeing. And once we arrange the evidence that way, the idea of previous worlds stops being a fantasy about vanished superpowers. It becomes something far more difficult to dismiss. Human beings have already lived through multiple worlds that no longer exist. The final question is not whether that happened. It is what kind of world ours will become when it does. By now, the phrase seventh civilization means something very different from what it seemed to mean at the beginning. It no longer points toward a hidden list of 6 forgotten empires. There is no reliable archaeological sequence showing 6 advanced global civilizations rising and collapsing before ours. The Hindu Yugas do not secretly encode that sequence. The Greek ages of man do not confirm it. The Mesoamerican Suns belong to a different cosmological system. Theosophy's 7 root races are a modern esoteric construction, not a buried prehistoric chronology. And yet the deeper idea has not disappeared. It has become harder to dismiss, because human beings really have inhabited worlds that no longer exist. The first was biological. For most of our species' history, humanity was not represented by one surviving human population. Neanderthals existed, Denisovans existed, other archaic human populations existed. Some met our ancestors. Some exchanged genes with them. Then those populations disappeared as distinct peoples. Parts of them remained inside us. Their languages did not. Their names did not. Whatever identities they possessed did not. Their world ended without humanity ending. That is one kind of reset. The second was ecological. Humans once lived among combinations of plants and animals that would now seem unfamiliar. In many regions, large-bodied animals shaped the landscape and human behavior. Then environments changed. Species declined. Some disappeared entirely. Knowledge built around them became useless. A hunting strategy passed down for generations might suddenly describe a world that no longer existed. The animal could remain in memory after it vanished from the landscape. Then even the memory could disappear. That is another reset. The third was geographic. At the height of the last ice age, global sea level was far lower than today. People inhabited landscapes that have since been submerged. They crossed land, where boats now travel. They followed rivers that now continue beneath coastal waters. They used shorelines that no longer exist. As the ice melted and the oceans rose, those places were reorganized or lost. Not necessarily in one spectacular wave. Sometimes through generations of retreat, a place becomes wetter. A route becomes unreliable. Salt water advances. Fresh water becomes harder to find. People move. Their children inherit another shoreline. Eventually, the old landscape exists only in memory. Then even that disappears. That is a reset as real as any mythic flood. The fourth was climatic. People living through the end of the Pleistocene did not experience climate as a graph. They experienced it as food, as distance, as uncertainty, as animals arriving at the wrong time, as plants appearing differently, as older knowledge becoming less dependable. The Younger Dryas is only one especially striking episode in a much longer history of climatic instability. But it reveals how quickly conditions can change relative to human lifetimes. People adapted. That does not mean the old world remained intact. Sometimes survival itself is the mechanism by which a world disappears. You adopt a different strategy because the old one no longer works. Your children learn the new strategy. They never experience the one you lost. After enough generations, adaptation becomes tradition. And tradition disguises the fact that it began as emergency. The fifth reset was social. Human communities increasingly altered the relationship between movement, food, and place. In parts of Southwest Asia, people invested more heavily in repeated gathering places, increasingly settled lifeways, cultivation, storage, and eventually agriculture. The transformation was not clean. Hunter-gatherers did not vanish the moment somebody planted a seed. Different ways of life overlapped for long periods. But gradually, staying became more important, and staying changed human problems. Permanent structures had to be repaired. Stored food had to be protected. Waste accumulated. Neighbors became difficult to escape. Land mattered differently. Inheritance mattered differently. Authority could become tied to resources. Larger communities could coordinate projects that small mobile groups could not. Göbekli Tepe stands near this transformation as a reminder that social complexity appeared in forms older models underestimated. Its builders did not need writing to organize monumental work. They did not need cities to create shared architecture. They did not need a vanished super-civilization to teach them how to be intelligent. They were already human. That was enough. The sixth reset was cultural. This one is the hardest to see because it often leaves the least dramatic evidence. Languages disappear. Rituals disappear. Songs disappear. Routes disappear. Technical knowledge disappears. A healer dies without training another. A boat-building method is no longer needed. A seasonal path becomes inaccessible. A word for a plant disappears from speech. A story is told one last time, and nobody realizes it was the last. These are tiny endings, but multiply them across tens of thousands of years, and the amount of lost human knowledge becomes almost impossible to comprehend. Archaeology gives us fragments. Stone survives well. Meaning does not. A monument can remain for 11,000 years, while the explanation for it disappears completely. An object can survive, while the skill required to reproduce it is forgotten. A burial survives, while the name of the person inside it is erased from every living memory. This is the form of loss most difficult for modern people to accept, because we are surrounded by storage, photographs, hard drives, cloud servers, libraries, recorded voices, written law, maps, digital archives. We live inside a civilization obsessed with external memory. Prehistoric humans relied far more heavily on living memory, and living memory has one unavoidable weakness. It dies. Every human society therefore exists inside a countdown, not necessarily toward extinction, toward forgetting. People die. New people inherit what survives. They preserve some things carefully. They alter others. They misunderstand some. They discard some. They invent replacements. Eventually, the world of the ancestors becomes history, then archaeology, then mystery. Our civilization is not outside that process. We are simply experiencing it from the inside. That may be the most useful way to understand the phrase, the seventh world, not as a literal ancient numbering system, as a perspective. If we count vanished human realities rather than imaginary empires, we are already standing on top of many worlds, the biological world of multiple human populations, the ecological world of extinct ice age environments, the geographic world of drowned coastlines, the climatic worlds reorganized by abrupt environmental change, the social worlds transformed by settlement and agriculture, the cultural worlds erased whenever languages, traditions, and knowledge systems disappear. And then there is ours. The seventh, only because we have chosen to call it that. Our world is unusual in several obvious ways. It is globally connected. A crop failure in one region can influence prices thousands of kilometers away. A disease can move between continents faster than almost any ancient traveler. Information travels nearly instantly. Large cities depend on food, water, electricity, transport, finance, communication, and supply systems whose full operation no individual understands. That complexity produces enormous resilience. It also produces dependence. A person living in a modern city does not need to know how to grow wheat. Someone else does. They do not need to know how to generate electricity. Someone else does. They do not need to manufacture antibiotics, maintain water purification, repair satellites, refine fuel, build communication networks, or keep refrigerated food moving across long distances. Civilization allows specialization by turning private competence into shared systems. That is one of its greatest achievements. It also means that most of us survive through systems we cannot personally reproduce. Earlier societies knew this problem in smaller forms. A village depended on specialists. A city depended on surrounding farmers. A state depended on roads, storage, administration, and political cooperation. Complexity has always created efficiency by spreading knowledge across people. Our civilization has simply pushed that principle farther. This does not mean collapse is inevitable. History does not provide a law saying every complex society must fail after a fixed number of centuries. The ancient cyclical cosmologies were not scientific forecasts. We should not turn them into one now. But they noticed something real. Human systems are temporary. Every civilization that once seemed permanent eventually changed. Some declined. Some fragmented. Some were conquered. Some transformed gradually enough that descendants continued while the old political order vanished. Rome did not disappear from the planet in one night. Neither did ancient Egypt. Civilizations can die bureaucratically. Administrations stop functioning. Trade changes. Political authority fragments. Institutions lose meaning. People remain. That distinction has followed us through the entire story. The world can end while the people continue. This is easy to understand when we look backward, harder when we look at ourselves. We naturally treat the present as a destination because we are alive inside it. Previous societies probably did the same. A person living in a prosperous ancient city did not spend every morning imagining archaeologists excavating the neighborhood thousands of years later. A farmer did not look at a temple and think of ruins. A bureaucrat did not record grain inventories for the benefit of modern historians. They were living. The future ruin was invisible. The same is true of us. A bridge is a bridge. A highway is a highway. A city is a city. We rarely experience them as future archaeological layers. But, given enough time, that is exactly what they become. This does not require catastrophe. Maintenance stops. Water enters. Metal corrodes. Plants grow. Roofs fail. Roads break. Sediment accumulates. Later, people reuse material. New structures cover old ones. Coastlines move. Rivers shift. A city becomes a deposit. A civilization becomes a pattern in soil. Still, our technological world would leave marks far more persistent than many prehistoric societies did. Mines, artificial materials, altered sediments, chemical signatures, massive landscape changes. Species moved far from their natural ranges. A future investigator may misunderstand us, but it would be difficult to miss that something unusual happened. That fact should keep us disciplined when thinking about deep prehistory. The absence of evidence does not prove that nothing complex existed. Archaeology has genuine blind spots, but the scale of a claim should match the scale of evidence we expect. A sophisticated maritime culture using mostly perishable technology can disappear almost silently. A global industrial civilization should not. That boundary allows wonder without abandoning standards, and wonder survives perfectly well. There is still an enormous amount we do not know. Submerged prehistoric landscapes remain incompletely explored. New archaeological sites will be found. Existing sites will be redated. Ancient DNA will probably reveal population histories we have not yet imagined clearly. New methods will detect behavior that currently leaves only faint traces. Some assumptions we hold today will look naive in another 100 years. That is almost guaranteed. But future discoveries do not need to validate Atlantis to matter. They only need to reveal people more accurately. That is enough. The deepest loss in prehistory may not be a city. It may be the disappearance of ordinary human knowledge. Think again of a person standing on an Ice Age coastline. That person could know exactly where to find water, which weather made travel dangerous, where animals passed, which plants were edible, how to repair a tool, who belonged to which family, where people met during a particular season, which stories explain the landscape. To that person, this was not primitive information. It was the structure of reality. Then the shoreline moved. The people moved. The language changed. The knowledge ceased to be useful. Eventually, nobody remembered the place at all. Today, the same landscape may be beneath the sea. A ship passes over it. Someone checks a screen. Nobody on board knows that thousands of years earlier, another human looked across that place and thought of home. That is a lost world. No marble palace is required. There is another quiet irony here. The lost civilization stories we create often reveal more about us than about the people we are trying to recover. We imagine ancient high technology because technology defines power in our own world. We imagine global empires because global organization feels significant to us. We imagine lost energy sources, machines, and scientific knowledge because these are the forms of knowledge we fear losing. An Ice Age hunter may have defined an advanced society very differently. A reliable source of food, a strong network of allies, good clothing, knowledge of roots, people who remembered the seasons, a way to keep children alive through winter. The definition of civilization depends partly on what problem you are trying to solve. For most humans who ever lived, survival remained close enough to daily life that the distinction between technology and wisdom would have been less obvious than it is for us. Knowing how to live was the technology. This may also explain why ancient catastrophe traditions so often preserve moral knowledge rather than engineering knowledge. The survivor does not usually emerge from the flood with a blueprint for an electrical grid. The survivor carries rules, obligations, warnings, relationships with the sacred, a model of why the old world failed and how the new one should behave. Whether those explanations reflect historical disasters, theology, symbolism, or combinations of all three, they reveal what cultures believed mattered after everything else had been stripped away. This is where the old stories and the archaeological record finally meet, not because they tell the same chronology, but because they ask the same human question. What survives when a world does not? Sometimes genes, sometimes tools, sometimes buildings, sometimes stories, sometimes only consequences. The 6 worlds before ours, if we use that phrase carefully, did not vanish equally. The Neanderthal world left genetic traces. The Pleistocene ecological world left bones and sediments. The low sea world left submerged geography. Climatic transitions left signals in ice, sediment, and ecosystems. Early social transformations left settlements and monuments. Lost cultures left objects whose meanings we can no longer recover. Each world survives differently. That may be why the past is so difficult to reconstruct. We keep expecting one kind of evidence. A city, a text, a dramatic ruin. But memory is distributed. The earth remembers one part. Genes remember another. Stone remembers another. Myth may remember something else, though imperfectly, and much is simply gone. There is no archive containing every human world. There never was. The remaining record is selective. That should make us cautious. It should also make us more attentive. A chipped stone tool looks modest until we remember that the hand holding it belonged to someone who had an entire life. A submerged river channel looks geological until we remember that people may once have crossed it. A fragment of ancient DNA looks technical until we understand that it records an encounter between populations tens of thousands of years ago. A carved pillar looks silent until we realize that dozens or hundreds of social relationships were required to put it there. The past becomes larger when we stop demanding that it look like us. And perhaps that is the final correction to the seventh civilization idea. We do not need 6 versions of our civilization before us. That may be the least interesting possibility. The human story is richer, precisely because the previous worlds were different. They solved different problems. They knew different landscapes. They organized themselves differently. They valued forms of knowledge we may barely recognize. Some of those worlds left monuments. Some left almost nothing. All were real to the people living inside them, just as ours is real to us. There is no evidence that a cosmic law guarantees our world will be destroyed. No hidden calendar tells us when a 7th age ends. No archaeological pattern predicts the exact future of modern civilization. History is not prophecy, but history does remove one comforting illusion. Continuity is not the same as permanence. Humans have survived enormous changes because humans adapt. Adaptation is one of our greatest strengths. But adaptation can also mean becoming something the previous generation would barely recognize. The people survive. The world changes. That has happened before. It will happen again, although we cannot know its form. And this returns us to the question that began the journey. What if our civilization is not the first, but the 7th? Taken literally, the evidence does not support it. There is no hidden archaeological staircase of 6 global supercivilizations leading to us. But if the question is allowed to become more human, the answer changes. We are not the first people to inherit ruins. We are not the first people to live on top of forgotten lives. We are not the first people to assume that the landscape around us is normal. We are not the first people whose knowledge depends on systems that could change. And we are certainly not the first people to wonder whether those who came before knew something we have forgotten. In that sense, we live very late in an old story, not the 7th chapter of a secret history. One more human world among many. A world built from the remains of older environments, older populations, older experiments, older mistakes, and older successes. A world whose people carry fragments of other humans in their DNA. Whose oceans cover places where ancestors once walked. Whose farms emerged from experiments begun thousands of years before writing. Whose cities depend on innovations accumulated by people whose names are gone. We inherited far more than we remember, and one day, others may inherit from us in exactly the same way. Not necessarily after disaster, not necessarily after collapse, simply after enough time. Some things will survive, most will not. A future person may hold an object from our world without understanding what it meant. They may stand above buried infrastructure and not know the names of the people who used it. They may tell stories about us that we would find strange. They may exaggerate our wisdom or our foolishness. They may assume our machines mattered more to us than they really did. They may mistake an ordinary object for something sacred. They may wonder why we built where we built, why we moved so much material, why we changed so much of the planet, why we believed our systems would continue, and they may ask the same question we have asked about people before us. What happened to them? The answer will probably be complicated. It almost always is. For now, our world is still here. The lights are on. The roads are used. The cities are inhabited. The oceans continue moving across landscapes that have changed many times before. And beneath those oceans, under fields, inside caves, within our genes, and in fragments of stories whose origins we may never recover, earlier human worlds remain, not intact, not waiting to be rediscovered exactly as they were, only in pieces, enough to remind us that history is much deeper than civilization, and that civilization is much more fragile than history. So if we are the seventh world, we are not the seventh, because some forgotten tablet counted 6 before us. We are the seventh, because for a moment we chose to count the worlds humanity has already lost. And when we do, the number itself matters less than the pattern. People live, people adapt, worlds change, memory fades, something remains. Then someone much later finds the fragment and begins asking questions. Tonight, that someone is us.